my first and main reason is that William had three ambitious sons: Robert, William Rufus, Henry, and they all wanted as much power as possible, as proven by what happened after William died. And the reason why this is my main reason is because if William only had one son, or if William only had one son that was ambitious, then he wouldn't have had a problem, because that person, that son, would have become king, undisputed, because the others wouldn't have been interested. But as it happened, he had three sons with lots of ambition who all wanted to be in control. And that would be my main reason. And if you want proof that they were ambitious, well, Robert had his hand in the 1088 rebellion, where he was trying to, or was probably aware of and encouraging a rebellion against William Rufus, probably to put Robert on the throne. Henry managed to manoeuvre his way into actually becoming King of England later, and obviously William Rufus became king himself after his dad died. So all of them had some designs on the throne, and two of them actually became king. My second reason was kind of a two-way reason, I would say. Another reason why there was a disputed succession was because of William's relationship with Robert, particularly the Battle of GERBEROI, which is where William actually lost a battle. That was really rare, and he lost it against his son, his eldest son, Robert. There'd been a big falling out, you might remember from your lessons, something to do with William Rufus and Henry weeing on his brother and his mates, and William not doing anything about it, so Robert storms off, and the younger people in Normandy all go off with him, and their dads end up fighting against sons. And anyway, William loses and has to promise after that that Robert is his heir, which he does. And then, when William dies, he gives the throne of England to William Rufus rather than to Robert. So he breaks his promise after the Battle of GERBEROI. The Battle of GERBEROI probably made William really dislike Robert, because nobody likes losing, and the fact that Robert dared to fight him in the first place. So that battle in itself, and the fact that he fell out with Robert, is one big reason perhaps why William gave the throne to William Rufus. And by doing it, giving the throne to his second eldest son, he caused a problem and a succession crisis, because his eldest son thought he should have been king. So there we go, William's relationship with Robert. And finally, you could write about the fact that the Earls did not want two masters. The Earls, William's Earls, were Earls in Normandy originally, and then William invaded England and they became Earls in Normandy and England. And that was fine, because there was a King of Normandy, a King of England, who was also the Duke of Normandy, so there was one person to listen to. But when William dies and two sons are put in charge of those two different places, it becomes a problem. Because what if William Rufus says one thing and Robert says another thing, and give conflicting orders? Who are you going to side with? Because you've got land in both places. So there was a succession crisis, because the Earls really would rather have had one ruler of both places to make things a bit easier and less complicated to them. And then so this perhaps is why some Earls were willing to side with Robert and Bishop Odo and try to rebel against William Rufus shortly after he became king in 1088. My number one reason would be castles. They crop up time and again, and there's plenty of examples of why castles were so important, which we'll go through and you can see on the screen, but the explanation would be the English were not used to castles. They didn't exist in England until William turned up with these Motte and Bailey castles, and the English had no experience of defeating them and didn't really have the technology to do so either. So, examples. Well, the revolt of Edwin and Morcar in 1068 was stopped without a fight when William built a castle which split Edwin from Morcar, and they surrendered. The Vikings always went back home to Denmark, never even trying to take a castle. Only one rebellion of all the rebellions that happened against William ever took a castle, and that was the Second Northern Rebellion at the end of 1069. And that was so serious, it must have played a part in William's decision to harry the north, because he must have perhaps been shaken by how serious that rebellion ended up being. And as we know, that rebellion failed anyway, even though they did manage to take a castle. But castles were hugely important. William built hundreds up and down the country. He wouldn't have bothered to spend time, money and effort into building so many castles around the country if he didn't think they were crucial to him controlling England. And there's plenty of examples to suggest that they were crucial. Another reason William was able to keep control was because of his own bold and decisive leadership. William's most dangerous period as king was in the early years, from 1066 to the early 1070s, specifically 1071, when he was faced with far more rebellions than he was in all of the rest of the time put together. And in those when those rebellions happened, he was almost always there personally at the head of an army. And the rebels didn't really often fight him. They mostly fled and had to resort to guerrilla warfare before William arrived, which shows how much respect and how much fear William managed to command because he was such a good leader, such a ruthless man, and his leadership of being there at the forefront and not delegating clearly helped. And after 1071, when the country was secure and he defeated all of those rebellions, he did kind of leave it to others. Like with the revolt of the Earls, he didn't even have to be there. But by that time, he really had control of England. And up until the point that he felt he had control, he made sure he was there to deal with his problems. And if you want a rebellion in evidence there, just think of a rebellion that's not the revolt of the Earls, and William was there, so you can name any of them. Another very important reason is that William wasn't actually facing much opposition in terms of like a serious threat. To give an example, I support Bradford City at football, and they're not a particularly good football team, but if they were playing against a primary school year 4 football team, I'd expect Bradford City to win by many, many goals. And so in this case, it's really important. There was a lack of a rebel leader and a lack of rebel coordination. There were so many different rebellions and so many different leaders in charge of those rebellions. Edric the Wild, Edwin and Morcar, Edgar the Atheling, Hereward the Wake, and so on. And few of these people were heard of or important at all before 1066. So that tells you how weak these people were. If they weren't particularly powerful before, and they're only known to us because of what happened after 1066 when they had their own little rebellion. There was never a point where all the rebels joined together, and if they did, they might have caused serious problems for William. But the problem was, all of the possible leaders who were powerful were pretty much Godwins or Godwinsons, and they died in the fighting of 1066. So yeah, and Edgar the Atheling was just about the best they had, but he was overlooked for the throne in 1066 completely. He was kind of a nobody in 1066. He wasn't a nobody because he was famous, well known, but he was a young lad. He didn't have a power base, he didn't have followers. They overlooked him for the throne, and he's the best they have to lead the rebels after 1066. So the reason why William won is because the opposition he was facing, they didn't coordinate things and join forces together, and they didn't really have a powerful, respected leader to unite them in the first place. Well, yes, appointing Lanfranc into one of the most powerful positions in the entire country is obviously going to give the Normans greater control of England, or give William greater control of England. People were stupendously religious at the time, and if the leading religious figure is a Norman, they're going to listen more to the Normans. And there's proof there because there was a massive explosion in the building of Norman-style churches. Some old churches were knocked down and changed to the Norman style. Services were changed to the Norman style. Cathedrals were built in the Norman style. Glastonbury, a famous abbey Glastonbury Abbey, and there was a very small monk rebellion. Now, they're not known for their fighting, but they must have been furious to have a go. 3 monks were killed in the end. What they were doing is they were rebelling against the fact that everything was being turned into the Norman style. And with LANFRANC coming in and making such sweeping changes to the church, this included replacing a lot of the important churchmen, or you could even say ecclesiastical men, which is the fancy word for churchmen. And so that by the end, every single bishop in the country was foreign born, except one by the time William died. So it gave William and the Normans massive control over the country to have control of religion, and that really gathered pace when LANFRANC was put in charge. So he could then make those changes to make it all a bit more Norman. It's not the only consequence. It created a better relationship with the Pope. Having a good relationship with the Pope was a really important thing back in the early medieval period. And Edward the Confessor, who ruled for a long time before, he did a lot of things that the Pope disagreed with, like appointing Stigand as Archbishop of Canterbury, because he was also Bishop of Winchester. And you weren't allowed to have 2 church posts, that was pluralism, but Edward did it anyway. So England had a poor relationship with the Pope under Edward, and under Harold Godwinson, because he kept Stigand. And William invited papal legates, that's like representatives of the Pope, in 1070, and allowed them to make a load of changes that the Pope would have approved of, including getting rid of Stigand and replacing him with LANFRANC. So it gave the country, William, and the Archbishop of Canterbury all a more favourable relationship with the Pope. A final consequence, you could say, is the appointment of LANFRANC made for a more efficient, fairer church. Because, very many different reasons, but simony was frowned upon, which is under LANFRANC, it was outlawed. So before LANFRANC came along, people could pay for a church position, so they could pay their way into power. Pluralism, which is what Stigand was guilty of, having more than one church post. So how could he have been Bishop of Winchester and Archbishop of Canterbury? These are 2 places quite far apart. How can you do both of those jobs? So he stopped that. Nepotism, well, that was church positions running in the family. And one of the ways he got rid of that was stopping priests from getting married. So if they're not married, they're not having children, so they can't pass on these positions. But he wanted the church positions to be given more on merit than just because they're family or because they're willing to pay. And he also had more regular meetings of key church leaders, so that the whole system would be a bit fairer and a lot more efficient. The first of my 2 reasons why he established the March of Earldoms was to reward loyal, powerful followers, which is a very important thing to do if you're taking over a country. You need people you can trust, and you need people who want to work for you. And so that's one reason. One big reason why he established the March of Earldoms. And you can see the names of the 3. I can't even begin to pronounce the first one. I never did French at school. But what was it that they got out of being a Marcher Earl? Well, they didn't have to ask permission to hold market or build castles, so that gives them a lot of power. They could astonishingly also set their own laws, which gives them a huge amount of power. No other earl could do that, they all had to go by the king's laws. They also had a right to collect tax in the area for themselves. So that is sort of the best possible terms of being an earl. Of course, there's drawbacks of being an earl in that area, which is another reason which we'll come to next. But by making somebody a Marcher Earl, it was like saying, I need to reward you here, and here is my reward. You enjoy the power and the money that comes with that status. So you also don't give away so much power unless you want something in return, and this was the drawback to being a Marcher Earl, the Welsh. the area is on the border of England and Wales, and the main job of being a marcher, which is why they were allowed to build castles when they wanted, was to keep the Welsh out of England. Edric the Wild had been an English thane who raided into England in 1067 with the help of the Welsh. So there's an example of the Welsh causing problems for William during his reign. But they'd also caused a lot of problems for Edward. So many problems, in fact, that he'd had to order an invasion of Wales in 1062. So the Welsh were a big problem. They'd raid into England, they'd take some wealth, and then they'd go back again. And so this is why William needed powerful, loyal people in those areas to protect England. Well, I'm only going to do 2 paragraphs, and it makes more sense to do church and not church. And actually my argument would be William's policy of Normanisation, which means turning things Norman, was the biggest consequence was actually increased control of England itself. So by the time William died, those in control of the country, the earls, the barons, were overwhelmingly foreign-born. All the English threats had been dealt with. And the potential English leaders, so Waltheof was dead, the sheriffs had become more powerful and sort of filled the vacuum of the earls, giving sheriffs more power because William was ruling by writ. He was sending written instructions out because most often he wasn't even in England. So that negated the great power the earls used to have. Also, Edgar the Atheling was a potential threat. He did rebel a few times, but by the time William left, he was out on crusade and not a problem, not a thorn in William's side anymore. So yeah, by changing things to become more Norman, i.e. his policy of Normanisation, he put people in the powerful positions who weren't English, so it increased control of England for William. Of course, it did increase control of the church. This just wasn't the most important consequence. The increased control of the church helped William in that it helped him control England as a whole, which was his main aim. So that was the main consequence. But it did increase control of the church, did the Normanisation policy, because, well, LANFRANC was a Norman, he was put in charge of the church. They changed it so that things that weren't allowed in Normandy weren't allowed in England, like simony, nepotism, pluralism, see last question. Church services were changed so they were more Norman. Churches were built in the Norman style, and cathedrals were built in the Norman style as well. And because people were extremely pious, religious at the time, it gave William greater control of England because Normans were the ones in the churches telling them how to be and what they should be doing. So yeah, Normanisation increased control of the church, but it was the least important reason because that only gave William greater control of England, which was his main aim in the first place. This question again, I'll be doing 2 paragraphs because it's just either it was the same or it was different. And so, no, he didn't use the same methods would be my first paragraph. He harried the north, but he didn't harry anything that we know of after the Hereward the Wake rebellion. He had to build a bridge to defeat the rebels in the Hereward the Wake rebellion because there was on the Isle of Ely. There was no bridge building that we know of in the rebellions in the north. He actually got a witch to hurl curses at the rebels on the Isle of Ely in Hereward the Wake. That's a bit mad, didn't do that in the northern rebellions. And there's also the possibility, some sources suggest that he bribed monks to show him a secret path to get across the marches to the Isle of Ely. Another thing that he didn't do in the rebellion of the north. There are, though, a number of similarities. For example, in both cases, he personally took command of the situation, as he so often did, and he went and dealt with it himself at the head of his army. In both rebellions, Vikings, Danish Vikings, were part of the rebellion, and in both cases they were paid to go away. And in both cases he was utterly ruthless when he had defeated the rebellion, harrying the north. That led to tens of thousands of people dying, and after he'd caught all the rebels that were with Hereward, he had hands and or feet cut off of them, or eyes gouged out. So terrible mutilations, incredibly ruthless, and so there are a lot of similarities, and it's up to you to decide ultimately when you do your conclusion whether you think there were more similarities or differences. You could argue either way, just make sure you come down on one side or the other and don't sit on the fence. Well, this is a very niche question, but Tostig was a Godwin. Tostig Godwinson, and he was a southerner who'd been put in charge of the north, probably only because he was one of Edward's favourites at court, so the sources suggest. So he was a southerner put in charge of the north. You know how us northerners feel about southerners sometimes. And not only that, but Tostig also tried to enforce law and order when the earldom of Northumbria was used to being fairly lawless and not having all of this. So they weren't happy about the idea of the changes that Tostig was bringing, and they weren't happy about Tostig himself. And so one example is that blood feuds were more prevalent, they happened more often in the north than the other parts of England. And we know about blood feuds from our crime and punishment topic. So yeah, they didn't like the changes he was bringing, they didn't like who was doing it, so they rebelled against him. One reason. The only other reason I can think of that you could make a paragraph out of here is that Tostig spent a lot of time in London and not in Northumbria. That would annoy the people living in the north, especially the more powerful ones who'd want decisions made and things doing about problems, and Tostig, the man with the power, wasn't often there to sort it out. So that would cause anger in the first place, but it also would mean that when anger started to rise up, if people start talking about rebellion, Tostig's not there to deal with it, and so anger against him, and I'd use that little phrase, could grow unchecked, which obviously it did, because eventually they rebelled against him. This is an old classic and probably a likely question that you get asked in the exam. I always think the main reason was a lack of a blood heir. If Edward had had a son, it was incredibly likely that that son would have been the next king. Or even if he had a brother or anything, but he had no blood heir. The custom was to pass to a son. This happened before Edward, so there was a king before Edward called King Canute, and he passed the throne to his sons, first Harefoot and then Harthacnut. And after Edward, of course there was Harold Godwinson who got killed in the Battle of Hastings, but after Edward, when William died, he gave the throne to his son William Rufus. But Edward had no son to pass the throne to, so it left it open for ambitious people to attempt to claim the throne. If he had had a son, all of the other causes probably wouldn't have been a factor, because it would have probably been a throne inherited by Edward's son. Especially because Harold Godwinson would have been the uncle of any son, and he was one of the main contenders, because of course Edward was married to his sister. So yeah, lack of blood heir, main reason in my opinion. And although Edward didn't have a son, he could have helped the situation by being a bit more decisive, but he wasn't. And you could say Edward's capriciousness, which is a fancy way of saying couldn't make up his mind, was a key reason why there was a succession crisis. There is evidence that he might have named William as his heir in 1051-52, because he'd fallen out with the Godwins at the time and probably wanted a powerful ally. It might have been the case that he wanted Edgar the Atheling to be his next his heir, because why would he send people to go and look for his nearest blood relative for no reason? That must have been something that was a factor in his reasoning to send for them. And he definitely named Harold Godwinson on his deathbed. Even the Norman source, the Bayeux Tapestry, agrees that Harold Godwinson was named on Edward's deathbed. So there's a potential 3 times that Edward changed his mind, which confused the whole situation and gave different people a claim to the throne. And finally, there wouldn't have been a succession crisis if England was a terrible, poor, if England was a poo hole. But it wasn't. It was an attractive country to any potential ruler. It was fairly well protected by the sea. It had established market towns and trade. This is really important, an established coinage system. It wasn't particularly common at the time in the early medieval period for the economy to be based on coins, but England's economy was. Instead they had more of a swapsy sort of thing, an exchange economy you would say, where it was pure just swapping one thing for another. But in England there was an efficient coinage system with mints making coins at the amount decreed by the king. And there was also, astonishingly, an efficient national tax system, so any potential ruler could get money out of people a lot easier than they maybe could in other countries at that time. And the national tax system that had been established was the Danegeld, which was something that had been established by previous kings to try to stop or to pay for stopping Viking invasion. But it had still existed long after the Vikings. There'd been a massive threat. They were still a threat, of course, but anyway, the point is there's a lot to be attractive about England for a potential ruler, so this is why lots of people were willing to risk everything to try to become king of England.